Okay.
Who is Switzerland playing against?
Sweden.
Sweden.
Okay, let's go.
Brazil was playing against Belgium.
Right. Good.
So, wish you welcome for this press conference with Mr. Geoffrey Robertson and Mrs. Valeska Teixeira Martins about what's happening with Lula. That's our maybe not third press conference about this topic, but it's always a pleasure to welcome you for this team, and we are also interested to know what happens in Brazil and what will happen with Lula and his candidacy and everything. So thanks for being here. Before to give you the floor, I would like to ask you to sign our golden book, just a signature, and after we will introduce and we will start with the questions. I give you a little souvenir, small souvenir from the club. That's our last magazine with another Latin American guy, but it was a long time ago. Yeah. So, Geoffrey, you will start, I guess, and after, yes, this is Teixeira. Okay. So, please.
Voilà. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming out on this very warm day and this exciting day, because here, Switzerland is very shortly to play Sweden in the next match of the World Cup. So we can promise you to be fairly short to allow you to get back by the time of kickoff. But we want to take you from this warm and peaceful and utterly serene democracy to a dark prison cell, solitary confinement for Lula, one of the great figures of our time, one of the great figures of the developing world. To ask, does he deserve it? Being locked up for 12 years, the man who is the popular choice of every opinion poll for the elections in October, 3 months away of this enormous democracy. Will he be allowed to stand? Will his conviction, which I'm going to suggest is a wrongful conviction, a miscarriage of justice in a country which gave him no justice, should be upheld? What's happening to Lula? The answer, Lula is fighting on. So let's very quickly consider the fight thus far. Most of you will have heard of Lula, the little lathe worker who had passed no exam in his life other than to work a lathe. A worker kid who sold peanuts on the streets to keep his family in food, who came from utter destitution as a trade union leader, finally in the late 20s, and who formed the Workers' Party at a time when there was a military junta in Brazil, and he was imprisoned by the military, and finally came out, and in 2003 won 54 million votes. 2008, 58 million votes. Obama joked that he was the most popular man in the world. But more important than his popularity was the fact that even his critics credit him with pulling 20 million people out of poverty by programs like the Bolsa Familia program, giving money to mothers if they got their children inoculated and in school. So this man, who has been an inspiration, particularly to those countries where most people are poor, is now in prison. Of course, if he deserves to be in prison, if he's made any money out of his presidency of Brazil between 2003 and 2010, until he could have stood again, but he allowed Dilma Rousseff, his protege, to be president for the next 8 years. And he proposes to run as the Workers' Party candidate for president of Brazil in October. Well, he's in prison. How did he get there? Extraordinarily, because I believe he's utterly innocent of this charge, and I've looked into it very carefully. It relates to a beachfront apartment which his wife, the late wife, had bought a share in in a workers' cooperative back in 2005. And Lula declared his interest in it, his family interest in it, so it was no secret. Then, in 2010, after, or just as he was retiring, it was obtained, the building society went bankrupt, crashed. So the apartment overlooking a rather second-rate beach was obtained by OAS, a building construction firm, and one of those firms that is alleged to be involved in the corruption involving Petrobras. Now, what the firm did was simply, when it came to 2014, Lula is out of office. He has no power at all. But they do two things. First of all, they offer him a better apartment. Okay, instead of having one bedroom, it has 2 bedrooms. Secondly, they offer to do some work on it, to put in a lift. So it's an interesting kind of offer which they make to the best known person in Brazil. Why do they make it? Do they make it? Probably so that more people will buy the other flats in the apartment, knowing that ex-President Lula is there. But what is important is that they make that offer and Lula does not accept it. They remain the registered owner of the property, even today, registered owner. But what I think is even more important, because Lula was convicted by a very biased judge on the grounds of accepting a bribe. But there was no quid pro quo. There was nothing that Lula could or did offer to do in return for getting a better apartment. But, so there is this, I think, quite, if it were in Britain or Europe, in this case, undoubtedly he would win the appeal, because there is not the quid pro quo that is necessary in Europe for a bribery conviction. He doesn't promise to do anything, and he doesn't accept the gift. But there you have the mystery of how he was convicted by Judge Moro, how he was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, and why he's languishing in solitary confinement. He's not allowed to see anyone other than his lawyers, and once a week a member of his family. That is, he's not allowed to campaign. All the other rivals are out in the field, campaigning, speaking on television, radio, doing caravans in the districts of hundreds of thousands of people. Lula languishes in his prison cell, even though he is the favorite, even though twice as many people indicate that they would vote for him rather than his rival, who has been condemned as a right-wing evangelical military figure who promises to be the Trump of Latin America. Well, that's a matter for the Brazilian people to decide, but should they not have a fair chance to re-elect the president under whom they became great? The problem is that although there is no evidence of any gift, and Judge Morrow, who heads something called Operation Car Wash, which has 200 police and prosecutors attached to it, combed the world looking for evidence and found he none. No foreign bank accounts, no money ever came into Lula's pocket untaxed and undeclared. Not a cent came into Lula without his declaring it, paying tax on it. He made some money after he stepped down from the presidency in 2010 in exactly the same way as Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. He gave speeches. Sometimes he was able to charge quite a lot of money. Where did the money go? It went to an institute to develop his ideas for helping the poor. That was where the money went. His whole operation, his whole family was turned over by these prosecutors, headed by a judge of we can't understand. I, as a British Queen's Counsel, cannot understand a system based on the old Catholic system of the Inquisition, which has been abolished in Europe, that allows a judge to run the investigation, to head all the police work, to target a suspect, tap his telephones and order seizure and arrest, and then go on to try him. It's crazy to us. It could never be allowed. It's like the policeman who arrests you, taking off his helmet and putting on a wig and judging you and finding his target guilty, fulfilling his own prophecy. This could not happen. It's contrary to international law and international human rights because it is fundamental, your entitlement to an independent and impartial judge. But this judge not only tapped Lula and his family and his lawyers' telephones, but he released the transcripts and indeed the audio to the media, mainly the Globo anti-Lula media. This is a disgrace. It was unlawful under Brazilian law. And in any country in the world, a judge who had done that would not be allowed to continue the trial. But, of course, Moro did. He appeals to a faction in Brazil which is anti-Lula, anti-worker, and which really wants Lula to be destroyed, wants him to be out of contention for the 2018 elections. So, you have Judge Moro, who not only appears in public to condemn Lula, he signs books that are critical of Lula, he attends events which are critical of Lula, he is utterly biased against him. Of course, he's going to find him guilty. And when he appeals, here is a court whose chief judge describes the decision to convict and jail Moro as impeccable before he's heard any argument. The appeal proceedings which I attended were a farce. There were 3 judges, but there were 4 people on the judge's podium. Who's the 4th, I said. It turns out the 4th was the chief prosecutor, who sits with the judges, dines with the judges, who speaks, turns and speaks to his friends, the judges, and the defense has 15 minutes to argue that Moro's decision was wrong, and then the judges pull out their speeches already typed to read them, to even add to the prison sentence. So this is Brazilian justice on Lula. This is a group of the judiciary who are determined to destroy him as a candidate for the Workers' Party and to allow, as a result, whether this is intended or not, someone of the views that I've described to be elected. Well, is that democracy? We took Lula's case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Brazil said, oh no, the Human Rights Committee can't decide whether his trial was fair, whether the massive demonization of him in the press, whether the enormous, obvious bias of the judges, the Human Rights Committee can't decide that because of a technical idea that Lula could raise the matter with another remedy. Well, the Human Rights Committee a few weeks ago delivered a judgment in which it turned down Brazil's attempt to derail the case and said it would decide the merits of the case. It would go ahead to decide the merits of the case, and so Brazil has been, at an international level, called upon to defend itself against the allegations that it has presumed Lula guilty, that they tried him unfairly before biased judges and other criticisms. So that is the state of play here in Geneva. The state of play in Brazil, however, is that Judge Moro ordered Lula to go to prison before his final appeal could be heard, an appeal which has, on any view, a reasonable chance of success in the Supreme Court. And perhaps it's a measure of the extent to which justice is polarized in Brazil that the Supreme Court had to decide whether to release Lula on bail until it hears his appeal, and very narrowly, by 6-5, decided not to. So Lula languishes in prison. But interestingly enough, the Human Rights Committee, while of course it could not, it does in death penalty cases, in torture cases, but in very limited circumstance does the Human Rights Committee say, let him free, or let him out of prison, or let him out of detention. But the Human Rights Committee did make certain observations a few weeks ago on the fact that Lula was in prison and that his prospects of standing and winning the presidency were obviously diminished by not being able to campaign. And it did say that the Brazilian government should not take any action that would prevent or frustrate the case under consideration, and that it should not take any action that would render the expression, the decision of the committee, futile. So that what this means in practice is that he mustn't be treated in a way that would frustrate the committee's decision if it were in his favor. And if it were in his favor, it would declare that his trial was unfair, that his prosecutor had turned persecutor, and that his conviction should be quashed and that he could stand as president again. So the issue that, one of the issues that Valeska and her team are fighting in Brazil is to insist that in accordance with the Human Rights Committee directive, that Lula should be taken out of solitary confinement, that he should be allowed to campaign as a candidate in the presidential elections. But, and this was a very nasty little trick that the judges played, Lula had some money that was going to finance his campaign, pay his lawyers and so forth, that he'd earned from speaking over the years, like Blair and Clinton at these events for former presidents. They froze them. They took all his money. They took his wife's money. They took all the family money. They hadn't been able to show that a penny of this money had resulted from any kind of corruption. It was family money. It was money he had earned. And they seized it. They used their power to seize it. Now, that means that he doesn't have any personal money to back his campaign. And that he doesn't have any money to pay his lawyers. We are here at our own expense, unusually for lawyers, pro bono, because we believe in his, that he was wrongly convicted. So the fight goes on, because Lula is such an inspiration that many of the trade union movement will fight for him. He's such an inspiration even to his lawyers that they will work for him for free. And the fight will go on, because the system under which he has been convicted and thrown into prison until he dies, he's 71 already, although I suppose with the inspiration of Donald Trump in front of him, he's capable of doing a great deal of good. So there it is, that the fight goes on. And to explain and to answer your questions as to how the fight goes on in Brazil itself, here's Valeska.
Thank you. So please, you can push the button. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Geoffrey. It's an honor to be here in Geneva once again to explain the legal battle that Lula has been facing for the past 3 years, the unfairness of it all. Our visit is due to the 123rd session of the Human Rights Committee here in Geneva this week. And we thought that the world needed an update on what's happening with Lula. To begin the explanation, I'd like to give actually a testimony. The first time I had visited Lula in prison, it really was touching, because his question was why? Why such violence? He looked at me, he grabbed me by the arm and he said, why? Several times. It was heartbreaking. I will tell you that. An innocent man thrown in jail for political reasons, and even for political reasons. The violence of it all is really troubling. To see a man of his stature, a politician who's always surrounded by his friends, his family, his colleagues, members of his party, and so many people, to be locked up in a cell in isolation, because he's only allowed visit by from his lawyers, from the family once a week, and only 2 friends on a Thursday, not simultaneously, because then that would be a political reunion, political meeting, and they cannot have that. Lula is a wrongfully accused, wrongfully tried, wrongfully convicted, and wrongfully thrown in jail. He has proven during the first procedure that he's innocent. All of the witnesses claim he's innocent. All of the documents undoubtedly point to his innocence, even though he was convicted. He was convicted not without any evidence, but in spite of the evidence of innocence that was produced in the files. And it was announced. Judge Moro has always announced that he would convict Lula. We believe that his jurisdiction, the Court of Curitiba, was carefully chosen in what we call a fight, political fight, a legal battle called lawfare, whereby you choose the jurisdiction where your case will be tried without any materiality on frivolous lawsuits. That will allow your lack of materiality or lack of prosecution, materiality of prosecution to win. It is the abuse and misuse of due process of the law for political reasons. He has been in the middle of the process. Lula has lost his wife. He has lost all of the money that he ever made legally. He is now doesn't have actually one dime to pay for even his healthcare insurance. His wife, who was wrongfully accused and died, had all of her assets frozen, as Geoffrey explained. The prosecution monitored the lawyers of the case in really, I don't think there are any precedents again like this in the world. They intercepted and tapped all of the telephones of the lawyers involved in the case, and they monitored the defense. We found out 2 years later from the interception that they had a chart with all of the measures, legal measures that the defense was going to take. For instance, if X happened, a habeas corpus would be filed. If Y happened, a writ of mandamus would be filed. So they had a chart with all of the intercepted telephone conversations between all of the lawyers, and they monitored it. So this information warfare that happened really, in our vision, nullifies all of the procedure against Lula, and it is an international scandal. How can a democracy stand that the defense is monitored in such a matter? There is no precedent, I don't think, in the world that is equal to this one. It has always been, and not only in this procedure, a trial of exception. And we're not the only ones saying this. The appellate court responsible for judging the car wash operation stated the state of exception. They said that the car wash operation did not have to comply with the general rule because it was exceptional. Therefore, it required exceptional measures. And this is how we try to litigate in a process without any rules, a process where the judges have become the enemies. They don't like losing. Basically, that's what happens. It's as Ferraioli said, you cannot have a democracy when a judge, or a rule of law when a judge does not want to lose. And losing, and by not losing means convicting Lula, always. We have had a tough past 10 days, also in the Supreme Court, where the rules have been ignored, where jurisdiction has been usurped by the panel with jurisdiction, all because the justice in charge of the car wash operation does not want to lose. So we play games in justice. And this is how we try to litigate and defend Lula in a country that is not complying with the law anymore. Lula has made it very clear that the only thing that he desires is to have his innocence declared and understood by the world. It is unthinkable to him to understand that people might have doubts in regards to his innocence, to the legality of his actions when he was in power as president, as well as out of power. The fact that he never took any illicit money from any contractors, anybody, that he only made money out of legal lectures that were paid, like so many other leaders, former presidents like Obama now also. the fact that we now have the leader of the polls in Brazil, the absolute leader, in jail, trying to campaign. He hasn't had his political rights removed. Actually, this is something that's going to be judged in its merits by the United Nations as well. He cannot defend himself from other candidates. He cannot give interviews. He cannot have political reunions. He cannot run a campaign from inside the jail. He cannot talk to other politicians. It took a long time for them to understand that Lula only had politicians as friends because he is a politician. They would not be allowed inside his cell. We had to prove that they were friends. But at last they understood that Lula is a politician and that he needs to be around politicians as friends. So it is a very hard time that he's going through, that the country is going through. To have the first runner, the leading man in the polls to be removed from an election illegally, arbitrarily, as Brazil is trying, is actually to attack the very core of our democracy. And this is something that we Brazilians cannot stand. We cannot have, as John Komarov says, rule of law, but instead of we're having the rule by law. And this is something that it's an imposition that no country should stand for. Lula has made it very clear that he will fight all the way to the end until he can prove his innocence and clear his name, nationally and internationally. And we have made it very clear to him that the fight will go on in Brazil. We will fight with the legal recourses that we have, with the legal appeals that we have, in order to prove his innocence, as well as internationally here, what we are doing now with United Nations and updating the United Nations as to the lack of compliance of Brazil to its international standards of human rights, to its obligations, the obligations that he contracted under international treaties such as the Pact and under the optional protocol. Brazil has to comply with basic human rights, individual guarantees. And Lula, as people like to say in the press, is not above the law, but he's not beneath the law. He deserves the full compliance of the law as just any other citizen. We in Brazil like to say a procedure that has no cover, so that the person is not judged by its name or by who you are. So your procedure is impartial. This is what we need now in Brazil. In spite of who you are, if you're a politician, if you're a common citizen, whoever you are, you just need justice. And this is what Lula is asking for. He's asking for justice. He's asking to run again, to be freed, because that's where he deserves to be as an innocent man. And I can only reassure to you that he's very serene. He understands what's happening. He wants to communicate daily. He's been reading dozens of books. And his message, his core message is, I'm innocent and I will prove it, no matter how long it takes. Thank you.
Thanks, Valeska, for that pen portrait of a man not desperate, but determined. So, any questions that anyone would like to ask about Lula's plans? Yes.
Robert James Parsons, independent journalist. 3 points, 3 questions, if you will. First of all, why does he need health insurance now? Is it standard that a person who is imprisoned has no right to any sort of medical care unless it's provided unless the prisoner provides for it himself? Second, why is he in solitary confinement? What is the law regarding this, considering that in many countries throughout the world, solitary confinement is strictly limited to somewhere between 24 and 72 hours, because beyond that it is considered torture. So under what provisions of what law is it justifiable to keep him in solitary confinement? And finally, what is the role of the United States in all this?
Valeska.
Well, we cannot forget that.
There's push the button, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I tell you.
Well, Lula had cancer he had throat cancer in 2011, so he does need special care. And he's not planning to stay in prison for too long, so we will try to keep his health insurance because as a post-cancer patient, he does need a lot of care, a lot of checkups, as well as his family's health insurance is also apparently all in one. As to solitary confinement, there is no rule that provides for that in Brazil. I think that it's psychological torture as well, because he stays by himself for the entire weekend, for any holidays. Whenever, for instance, there are World Cup games, he stays alone because even the lawyers cannot visit him. What we have to understand is that we are not in a regular procedure. Lula, I think, is bigger than prison itself. Lula would be entitled to be somewhere else as a former commander-in-chief, but Lula, as already said, has no right in Brazil. Lula is a citizen that's beneath the law, and therefore nothing applies.
Clarification then. In other words, the imposition of solitary confinement is totally arbitrary according to the judge in any case. There are no guidelines that you can refer to contest it, or not to mention any legal provisions.
We also have the Mandela rules, we cannot forget, that do not provide for solitary confinement for any prisoner. But we are trying to... there is a judge who's in charge of the execution of the sentence, and she's not allowing him to have any more visitors. This is the strict rules of his confinement. Only visited by a lawyer, 2 friends a week, half an hour each, and family on Thursday.
But there are no legal grounds on which you can contest this anywhere.
Well, we are contesting it, but we're not obtaining a lot of success in it.
America.
Well, the USA is something that should be actually analyzed, because we have a very troubling speech made by the DOJ prosecutor, Kenneth Blanco. It's something that we actually filed before the appellate court, where he explains that the DOJ, the Department of Justice from the United States, has an informal cooperation agreement with the car wash operation. And by informal, I would like actually that he explained, because our rules, we have a treaty dated 1997, which regulates how evidence should be shared and in terms of cooperation between the United States and Brazil. Informally, what he means is illegally. So we need an explanation. We have been denied such explanation. And I think not only Lula needs an explanation, but all of the Brazilians need an explanation. What is the Department of Justice? How is the Department of Justice cooperating informally with the car wash operation prosecutors and members? And we are being constantly denied such explanation. It's called the conspiracy theory, but it's actually not, because there are at least 5 speeches made by members of the Department of Justice of the United States stating that informal cooperation took place. And actually, the informal cooperation is the reason of the success of the car wash operation. How a member of the DOJ can claim that he helped construct the conviction against Lula, construct the case against Lula. And we are constantly being denied such explanation. Again, it's more questions than answers, but I think Brazilians, as well as Americans, need to know how this cooperation and why this informal cooperation took place and is taking place.
Thank you.
Yes.
Another question? No. Yes, please.
According to the Brazilian law, Lula can run the election or not. I think it is not clear, no? But I would like to know why it's not clear.
The Constitution says that that an individual's political right may not be removed unless by a final appealable decision. That's what the Constitution says. But we have a law called Clean Slate, which goes against the Constitution and says that once one person may not become eligible after a conviction by an appellate court. This is the Clean Slate law. There are many, in the doctrine, of course, variations, but we do believe that the law is unconstitutional. What Article 25 of the Pact states is that Lula's political right may not be removed unless preceded by a fair trial. And if this trial is anything but fair since the start, I would say Lula should not have been prosecuted to start with, because as we had explained, all of the illegalities, arbitrarities that were committed in the investigative phase would nullify the entire procedure. So Lula's political right should not be removed according to Brazilian law or international human law standards. And this is something that we are going to fight so that he may run and be in office once again.
It's a very complicated situation looking at it from the outside, and it's going to come to a crunch very quickly and very worryingly in September, because this is the timetable. The candidates for presidency register in August. The election is in October. There is an electoral court based of judges plucked from here and there, which has to decide in September, in a few weeks, whether an objection to a candidate is going to be successful. Now, an objection to Lula would be based on the Clean Hands law, but the Constitution overrides any other law, so they're going to have to go up to the Supreme Court in record time in September to decide whether the Clean Hands law, which would disqualify Lula from standing, is in fact unconstitutional, which, in my view,
The Supreme Court will decide.
Yes, so, and it has very little time to do so. And whether, if Lula is disqualified in a great rush, no doubt his supporters will take to the streets. And if he's not, and it will be unfair, because the principal representative of workers' rights and ideals will not be able to stand. And there is, Valeska, you might say a word about it, there is some attempt to short-circuit this by having the Supreme Court in July, when it's meant to be on holiday, actually make a ruling.
Well, actually, even if you consider the Clean Slate law, this sentence, this conviction, should not have any effect because it's unlawful. And the probability, and it's not final, and the probability of reversal of such sentence, of such conviction, is so high that it should not have any effects. neither in prison in terms of his liberty or any other effect that would restrict any rights from Lula.
Sure.
Three more questions. What about the inter-American human rights system? Have you made appeal to them for a ruling of some sort that would back up your own claims? Second, who were the observers, the international observers at the trial, and what have been their reactions? For example, has Amnesty International said something, considering that they focus on political prisoners? And third, where is he kept in prison, and how easy or difficult is it for his family or anybody else to get to him?
Well, he's been kept in prison in Curitiba, which makes it very hard for the lawyers to go there, for the family to travel every week to see him. So all of this is also against the Brazilian law. But again, this is how a trial of exception works. There is no law for the defendant. It all makes it very costly. Also. Flying or even driving down to Curitiba takes money, and all of his assets have been frozen. So every bit of difficulty, of hard time Lula and his families are facing at this point.
Okay, it's a good question, no, two good questions. The first one was whether we had considered going to the Inter-American Court, which is there for Latin America. Yes, we did, very carefully. But the problems with the Inter-American Court are considerable. Most seriously, delay. The Inter-American Court gave a very important decision in the case of Isha against Brazil. It was a case that began in 1997, and the decision wasn't handed down until 2009. It was a 12-year delay. What that decided, Mr. Isha was one of a group of protesters on behalf of poor peasants, and the investigating judge, exactly like Judge Moro, had intercepted the telephone calls and given them to newspapers, and the court condemned Brazil for doing that, and that so unfortunately powerless was the Inter-American Court decision that Judge Moro felt he could simply ignore it and do exactly the same thing. So there were two reasons, or three really, and the third reason was you cannot bring two cases at once. You cannot, as it were, sue in two courts at the same time. You have to choose your remedy. And because of the delays in the Inter-American Court process, because of the ineffectual content of Inter-American decisions in Brazil, and finally because we couldn't go to the UN if we went to the Inter-American Court, we decided to go to the UN. But we couldn't go to both. The Inter-American Court has, of course, more recently become very disturbed by its president has had to resign, and there have been serious problems, but I don't think they were in view at the time we made our decision. No. The other question was observers. I did try to encourage the International Bar Association to send observers. However, the problem, and I myself have been an observer in many cases going back 20 or 30 years, initially in South Africa. The problem is that you can't, as an observer, stay there for months. How long did Lula's case take?
2 years.
2 years.
the only organizations like the International Bar Association and Amnesty simply can't do observations of very long trials done in this way. I certainly remember being observer in a trial that took a week, but otherwise it's very hard to have people of the, if you like, the distinction you need as an independent observer. The other problem was Portuguese. Brazil speaks Portuguese, and Portuguese is not an international language. So it would have been necessary to find an independent Portuguese-speaking lawyer who had a long time available, because observers aren't paid. So I think they were some of the problems that were faced by the IBA.
But if I may then, what about Amnesty International? Don't they have a chapter in Brazil, someone permanently there, or the International Bar Association? And then what about appealing to someone such as Glenn Greenwald, who is, by this point, pretty close to bilingual, Brazilian Portuguese and the United States English, and who has repeatedly shown himself to be an advocate for such cases and who lives in Brazil? I mean, aren't there people there who don't need visas or whatever? And a third point then, I've known of people who went to Guatemala to monitor trials from the United States, and they had to go in and out. And they went, and then they came back, and whatever. And of course, it was costly and whatever, but that was the way they were able to remain in place long enough without arriving at complications of visas or residency visas or anything like that. There must be some way around this that you could call in these people or mobilize people there in Brazil who have the status and the reputation and whose presence there could circumvent these difficulties.
Yes, interesting you mentioned Glenn Greenwald, because he did, in fact, write quite a number of pieces I have seen condemning the prosecution and saying in more vigorous terms than I have that it was unfair and a persecution. And so, yes, there are many voices in Brazil, particularly of some of the most distinguished law professors who write, who sign letters, who write books. There was a book produced of a dozen or so law professors who condemned the illegality of Judge Mouro's conduct. But they, in the present arrangement in Brazil, have only persuasive power and not very much. You want to add something? Yeah.
We, as Lula's lawyer, welcome any kind of international observers, any investigative journalist who would like to analyze the documents, go over all the depositions. We're absolutely open to it. And something that we've been trying to get attention from the international media to analyze the trial. We get lost in translation, not only from Portuguese to the other languages of the world, but we also get lost in translation in terms of the legalish. All of the legal technical terms are very hard for the population to understand. And this is it's a way that lawfare works. You can do whatever, take any arbitrary action, and you'll be lost in translation with the public. When you, for instance, now, when you try to explain all of the technicalities of all of the legal appeals from the appellate court in the Superior Court of Justice and Supreme Court, people literally get lost. I cannot forget when we discovered the document that proved that Lula could not have ever owned the beach apartment. The name of the document was so technical that I think I got the people were lost by the second word. So all of this makes it very hard for people to understand what is really going on in the trial. We are now in a debate only amongst lawyers, legal scholars, legal professors, and this is something that helps to proliferate the arbitrarities that happen in the car wash operation. But not only a book on the legal procedures, on how wrong the procedures were taken by Judge Morrow, but there was another book also on, made by 100 jurists on the arbitrarities of the first conviction. Constantly, and I would say on a daily basis, jurists write to newspapers, to blogs, to legal blogs, criticizing the methods, illegalities, and unconstitutionalities of the car wash operation. But this is what we have been living in Brazil. The press, parts of the press in Brazil, also just create a distortion on what's happening in the procedure, trying to pass on the idea that corruption is being fought fairly when it's not. It's there is a political persecution, an unfair persecution against a political figure in Brazil. So it makes it very hard, but you know that's why the fight goes on.
Can I add this thought, because I've been a trial observer for 40 years, and I think there is another explanation. It's the C word, corruption. There was the appeal lasted a day, and I was the only observer, international observer in court. I had a translator, and I saw with my own eyes the bias of the court, with the prosecutor sitting with the judges and going out and having coffee and lunch with the judges. I saw the judges unroll their already written judgment 5 minutes after the defense had had its 15 minutes. You know, so I was able to see the farce, but there was no one else. The IBA, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty could all have attended a day and didn't, in the court of the judge who in the press had just said that Morrow's judgment was impeccable and unappealable. So I think my mind went back to Czechoslovakia, actually, in the 1980s, when I was working with Václav Havel, and until then, the Stalinists in power in Czechoslovakia had been prosecuting the Jazz Society and groups of liberals on the basis that they were spreading subversion, censorship. That was why Havel and others went to prison. But they started a new tactic in the mid-1980s of prosecuting for fraud or corruption. And they prosecuted the Jazz Society for corruption, for taking fees. But the Jazz Society was a non-profit-making organization. But it enabled, whenever this was raised at human rights bodies about how Czechoslovakia was putting in prison people for free speech or free music, they'd say, oh no, it's corruption, a crime in your country too. And so I think there is, for an establishment that wants to destroy a radical, progressive, whatever movement, using the C word, corruption, is a very clever tactic, because it does tend to deter people. Lula's a politician. Politicians, most perhaps, are corrupt. This is something that is almost almost when a politician is on trial for corruption, there is a kind of popular presumption that he's guilty. And so I think that may be, because so many are, and that may be one reason why at that level human rights groups have been less keen to see the miscarriage of justice. But nonetheless, once you go into it, I think any fair-minded person would realize that this is a frame-up.
Okay, thanks. There is no more questions. We will conclude. Maybe
All right, talk about the role of the media in this from the outset. That's something, because after all, this is the press club, and you did mention the distortion in the media. Could you give us a summary, at least, of how the media have treated this? Because that obviously is a major factor in public perception.
Well, parts of the media in Brazil have had a decisive role in the conviction of Lula. They created the presumption of guilt even before the procedure had started, even before he had been investigated. And on a daily basis, the media repeats over and over and over again that the prosecution was fair, the procedure was fair. They distort, even today, they were talking about the fact that Lula was convicted on the possession of the apartment, which was never proven, not even in the sentence. So the constant distortion of what happens in the procedure, the constant raising of suspicions, different suspicions on a daily basis does tend to violate the presumption of innocence that Lula has, and to help have a biased judge convict him on a meritless case. And this is how it works on every single case against Lula. And this is something that's not only happening in Brazil, but other places of Latin America, and should also be analyzed by the international media.
Yeah, I think it is a very significant factor. The Globo media, which is more right-wing than the Murdoch press and Fox News, played an important part in the demonization of Lula. From years before he was even charged, they constructed Lula prison dolls, dolls of Lula in prison uniform, which were turned by someone, we don't know who, into dolls, inflatable rubber dolls, which sometimes of 6 foot or so, which were held aloft at demonstrations, right-wing demonstrations of Lula in prison garb. And so this kind of media creating expectations that he would be convicted was certainly a factor. Plus the iconization of Judge Moro. Always, whenever you went into a bookshop in Brazil, you'd see pictures of Moro with an Eliot-esque pose, the great crime buster of America, the square jaw. And yet, this man is so monstrously unfair. He might be a good, obsessed prosecutor. That's his role. But to make him a judge is to make Brazil justice a laughingstock.
okay, last question.
Thank you. Just two more. I believe have other well-known human rights organizations been involved, like Human Rights Watch? And the second question, what's the next steps, legal?
Again, we welcome any international human rights organization to be involved, and if they want to analyze, they haven't. Again, I think Geoffrey's explanation was, I think, the correct one. I think the C word really does take a toll in raising awareness of what's happening with Lula. Well, in terms of next steps, we are now updating the United Nations as to the non-compliance of Brazil to its May 22nd decision. And we are now, as you all know, in legal recess in Brazil, legal vacation for a month. But we are we'll keep on fighting and filing all of the appeals that are necessary to preserve Lula's rights, and once the violations occur. And this is something that has to be explained. People were counting how many appeals we filed. But they do not ask. There were the same amount of violations that occurred. If a violation occurs, and illegality occurs, the role of the lawyer is to appeal The fact that the people are trying to intimidate, the press is trying to intimidate the defense team in Brazil, to not appeal, to allow illegalities to occur against Lula is, again, one more troubling effect of this rule by law, of this state of exception that we are now living in. And it's something that should be always refuted by the citizens of Brazil and should be taken notice by the international community as well.
And one thing that is and should be clear, there are ways of finessing these situations. In Malaysia, Anwar, in Ibrahim, in prison for years, runs in an election with Dr. Mahathir, is the president in waiting. What happens? He's pardoned and out of prison so that he can serve the country. And possibly you could look at that as a solution. But this is interesting. That's not for Lula. Yeah. He is determined to prove his innocence. That is his objective. He doesn't want this some sort of deal. He doesn't want this kind of compromise. He wants his innocence to be proven. And although we have no money to do it,
Yes.
we believe
It's
in it,
harder.
and so that's why we'll fight on.
Okay. So thanks a lot for your comments and presentation. We hope all the best. It's now the third time we welcome you for a press conference about Lula, and we hope yes,
there will be no
it will-
fourth time.
Yeah, yeah.
Lula himself will be
Yeah.
here. If there's a
we
fourth
should
time.
like to welcome him, yes, as a president.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks to everybody, and so wish you all the best. Okay.
Thank you so much.